I'd really like to welcome Andrew Jampol-Petzinger, who is going to be presenting a paper entitled Sartre, Deleuze and the Politics of Difference. Now, I don't know if you want to do what Jeff's been doing, been suggesting, and give us a little bit of a summary of your work, and then that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Professor Summerhall and Professor Bell for organizing this, and to the other speakers for being here. Yeah, so I mean, as a very fast word about the work that I do, so my original work, or my dissertation work, was on Kierkegaard and Deleuze, so in the domain of existentialism. That's, as I was saying, now sort of squared away a little bit. I have a book coming out on that topic. And so I've been turning a little bit more towards other and especially early existentialists, Sartre among them, but also folks like Fontaine and Bespalov, as a kind of a topic of curiosity. So this is a little bit sort of new sort of work to focus more on early existentialists, but that's sort of where I'm going and looking for some of their political philosophy in particular. I also can't help but mention before I start that because I have the 3 o'clock time slot, I fit perfectly into that comment in Nausea where Roquentin says 3 o'clock is too early and too late for anything. So I feel so that's what this will be. It'll be too early and too late for anything. Okay, we can get started here. Sartre's presence in Deleuze's thought is by this point well known, as well known perhaps as is the ambivalence of that same presence. Deleuze famously, and we will see that the name of Michel Tournier will play a not insignificant role in the story of Deleuze's relationship to Sartre, was something of a devoted acolyte to the work of Jean-Paul Sartre in his youth, voraciously reading early works like The Transcendence of the Ego and Being and Nothingness. And this, despite the disillusionment which marks a second moment in Deleuze's relationship to the existentialist, the disappointment, he reports, after their attendance at the famous Existentialism is a Humanism lecture, which perhaps led Deleuze to eventually renounce his earliest attempts at philosophical writing. 3 short pieces, there's also a 4th unpublished text on Sartre from the 80s, formerly in the possession of the Sartre scholar Jeannette Colombel, indicate Sartrean themes coupled with, as we will see, a modification by way of the category of sexuality. Later, Deleuze will laud Sartre in Il a été mon maître before criticizing him once more in scattered comments in The Logic of Sense and elsewhere. Deleuze's late essay on immanence, perhaps a synopsis of the metaphysics which he had come to espouse by the end of his career, returns to Sartre and the impersonal transcendental field, closing the circle of Sartre's significance for Deleuze after a manner. In this paper, I want to interrogate both the ontological and metaphysical side of Deleuze's reception of Sartre. Evidently, those ought to be distinguished a little bit more carefully, as the wonderful paper earlier indicates, but specifically with an eye to their similarities and differences politically. That is, in terms of the way in which the 2 philosophers made contact on questions of praxis and on their overarching views of questions of political conflict and struggle. To this aim, my intention is to do 2 things. First, I want to look towards a particular place in Deleuze's work where the question of subjectivity and ontology is framed in decidedly Sartrean terms, namely in the paper from 1967 entitled A Theory of the Other, Robinson and the Perverse, on Michel Tournier's novel of the same year, Friday or the Limbo of the Pacific. It's translated as Friday or the Other Island, and which paper, back to Deleuze, was republished as an appendix to the substantial monograph The Logic of Sense in 1969, a kind of companion volume to the 1968 magnus opus Difference and Repetition. The selection of this text to mention before turning to the second of the 2 tasks of this paper is also hardly arbitrary. As indicated in Francois Dost's biography of Deleuze and Guattari, Tournier and Deleuze, friends, both enthusiastically devoured Sartre's Being and Nothingness, and by Tournier's accounting, Deleuze, quote, knew it by heart. The second of the two tests I want to accomplish is to say something about the connection between this earlier account of selfhood and otherness in the Logic of Sense essay and Deleuze and Sartre's political philosophy. Not, at least not to the extent that I can avoid it, in the more formal accountings of serial subjectivity and group praxis in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, but rather in the more minor writings where specific accountings of political otherness is highlighted, namely in the early Anti-Semite and Jew and Black Orpheus, both of which represent concrete efforts at understanding and situating problems of otherness within a politically programmatic framework. Here we will see the extent to which Deleuze retains and the extent to which he revises certain elements of Sartre's approach to political difference and otherness. Let me just rearrange this a little bit. Okay. I couldn't put this one on. Okay, part two. Deleuze's essay, Michel Tournier and the World Without Others, addresses at once the complex question of the relationship between subjectivity and otherness, and also offers important insights into the way in which, at this point in Deleuze's intellectual development, Sartre's thought fit into his own ideas about subjectivity and difference. The text circulates around Tournier's 1967 retelling of the story of Robinson Crusoe, in which, by contrast to the more familiar version from Daniel Defoe, emphasis is placed squarely on the role that sexuality plays in the experience of solitude, as opposed to the more strictly economic picture of Robinson presented in the original story. It is on account of a kind of progressive undermining of Robinson's subjectivity in terms of sexuality, what Deleuze will elaborate in terms of Robinson's perversity, that Robinson's efforts to sustain the inherited practices of his prior life will come to nothing in a gradual disclosure of what is referred to as the other island in the novel. The island is named Speranza, the island of hope. Over the course of Deleuze's elaborations regarding Robinson's experience on Speranza, he finds opportunity to indicate certain important principles of his own conception of subjectivity, the role of the other in the constitution of human experience, and the nature of sexuality. The text, which has been given the title Michel Tournier and the World Without Others, most directly implicates the concept of the other as a structure present or absent in Robinson's subjectivity. And it is for this dimension that we will find Deleuze's text relevant for the question of his relationship to Sartre. Here Deleuze writes that in the absence of others, what is lost is the very possibility of object. Quote, instead of relatively harmonious forms surging forth from and going back to a background in accordance with an order of space and time, only abstract lines come to exist, luminous and harmful, only a groundless abyss, rebellious and devouring, nothing but elements. That is, a world which had hitherto been determined on the basis of what Deleuze will come to call the a priori other, now comes to confront Robinson as a series of disorganized and antagonistic elements, impinging upon the subject and rapidly clearing the gap, which Sartre might have called the nothingness, that separates the subject from the objects of experience. Quote, each thing having been rid of its relief and reduced to its harshest lines, slaps us in the face or strikes us from behind. The absence of others is felt when we bang against things and when the stupefying swiftness of our actions is revealed to us, end quote. But this initially aggressive and impinging world without others is not where the story of Robinson's isolation ends. Indeed, it is through the threshold of a loss of the coordinates of otherness that a latent dimension of subjectivity begins to reveal itself, one in which it is not the island which confronts and assaults consciousness, but indeed one in which consciousness finds itself extended throughout its erstwhile objects, a luminosity of consciousness that at its limits comes to coincide with the object of the island itself. Consciousness comes to reveal itself as a kind of consciousness of the island, a pure phosphorescence of things in themselves. Robinson becomes but the consciousness the island has of itself, becomes the island in itself, unquote. Hence, as Tournier writes, the return of consciousness and desire to the surfaces of things. Quote, it is a strange prejudice which sets a higher value on depth than on breadth, and which accepts superficial as meaning not of wide extent, but of little depth, whereas deep, on the other hand, signifies of great depth and not of small surface. Yet it seems to me that a feeling such as love is better measured, if it can be measured at all, by the extent of its surface than by its degree of depth, etc. It is on account of this description of solitude, which we'll have reason precisely to contest, this interpretation, that we first discover just what the other has been for Robinson, and what it continues to be for us, to the extent that we struggle to remount to this surface at which our consciousness, like our desire, coincides with its very object. Thus, Deleuze writes, it is through the absence of the other that we come to see exactly what the other is. It is, quote, neither an object in the field of my perception, nor a subject who perceives me. The other is initially a structure of the perceptual field, without which the entire field could not function as it does. That this structure may be actualized by real characters, by variable subjects, me for you and you for me, does not prevent its preexistence as the condition of organization in general to the terms which actualize it in each organized perceptual field, yours and mine. Thus, the a priori other, as the absolute structure, establishes the relativity of others as terms actualizing the structure within each field. And what is this structure? It is the structure of the possible, end quote. And Deleuze goes on to elaborate the ways in which it is through this structure of the a priori other that we come to feel the existence, for example, of the far side of those objects that appear in my perceptual field. In other words, that we stabilize our experience of things by virtue of their possible presence for others, by virtue of this a priori other. The other is thus not a specific other, but rather a condition for the possibility of experience of the sort whereby my consciousness presents objects to me in their separation from myself, gives them a stability and organization which remains even in my own absence. It allows for the minimum of distance by which my consciousness does not coincide with its own objects, as we described above. Section 3, Deleuze and Sartre on otherness. Perhaps the first point to make with regard to such a conception of the a priori other is to observe the simple unusualness of this account in Deleuze. It is unusual not for the least reason that Deleuze rarely, to my knowledge, speaks assertorically regarding the concept of the a priori other, of the a priori, as genuinely conditioning anything. That is, rarely do we find Deleuze making the claim that indeed some structure or category conditions our experience in the way that the other would seem to, according to the above account. This is perhaps because it is in fact Deleuze's great task, as a post-Kantian, to demonstrate that the perspective of conditioning possible objects of experience ought to be replaced by an account of the genesis of real experience. Quote, we must look for the conditions, not of possible experience, but of real experience, selection, repetition, etc. It is here that we find the lived reality of a sub-representative domain. In making the claim that the other constitutes an a priori structure for our perceptual field, tying our world of experience to a concept of that which we cannot see, and thereby stabilizing objects of perception, I would argue that we should in fact not understand this as a claim regarding what in fact determines experience, that is to say, on the assumption that we are condemned to some mode of experience, but rather perhaps as a claim regarding the conditions of a possible experience, if ever such a thing should arise. This somewhat unusual point of view may seem overly parsimonious, but when we look at one of Deleuze's major resources in this connection, the work of the philosopher Solomon Maimon, we can see just how an account functions to better situate Deleuze's observations regarding the other as an a priori structure and Deleuze's criticisms in this text of a Sartrean conception of the other, which I promise we will get to. According to Maimon, it is precisely the fact of propositionally organized experience which is subject to doubt in Kant's deduction of the categories of experience. As Maimon writes, quote, Kant assumes there is no doubt that we possess experiential propositions, and he proves their objective validity by showing that experience would be impossible without them. But on Kant's assumption, experience is possible because it is actual. But I doubt the fact itself. That is to say, I doubt whether we possess experiential propositions. And so I cannot prove their objective validity the way Kant does. As a consequence, Maimon argues, we can only reasonably propose that such conceptual coordinates are valid, quote, of the limits of objects of experience, but not, quote, for objects of experience themselves. There's a more elaborate story to be told here regarding the additional question raised against Kant, but equally by Kant, concerning the application of the categories of experience to particular instances, a topic which we will see has bearing upon the difference which Deleuze will observe between himself and Sartre. But for the time being, it is worth observing simply that the concerns which Kant might have regarding the necessity of otherness as a structure for the possibility of experience are clearly not at issue here, perhaps not least for the reason that Deleuze has no reason to suppose the validity of that concept, i.e. regarding the status of the other in experience, in our empirical experience. And this clearly will harmonize with the empirical observation that despite the avowed necessity of the other as an organizing principle for our object-directed experience, under conditions described in Tournier, the gradual abandonment, for lack of reinforcement, of this structure, we are capable of returning to that mode of luminous consciousness prior to its organization along the lines of mediated desire. Section 4, Sartre and the concept of otherness. I know I promised that Sartre would be in that previous section. That was a bit of a misnomer, but here we get a little more some Sartre stuff. Having now shown how Deleuze situates the concept of otherness in terms of a relationship between the subject and the organized world of experience, we can now ask just what it is that links this account to the account of otherness that we find in Sartre's work. And the major point to be observed here concerns Deleuze's criticisms of the Sartrean conception of the other, especially in Being and Nothingness. Here Deleuze writes, I quote at some length, Tournier's conception clearly contains Sartrean echoes. Sartre's theory in Being and Nothingness is the first great theory of the other, because it transcends the alternative. Is the other an object or rather a subject? Sartre is here the precursor of structuralism, for he is first to have considered the other as a real structure or a specificity irreducible to the object and the subject. But since he defined the structure by means of the look, he fell back into the categories of object and subject, making the other the one who constitutes me as an object when he looks at me, even if this means that the other would himself become an object when I, in turn, look at him. It seems that the structure of the other precedes the look. The latter, rather, marks the moment at which someone happens to fill the structure. The look brings about only the effectuation or the actualization of a structure which must nonetheless be independently defined, end quote. This criticism of Sartre is perhaps unsurprising when we bring what is said here into contact with the explanation that Sartre provides in the chapter on solipsism and Being and Nothingness as to his choice of approach with respect to the category of the other. There, Sartre specifically disavows his earlier, more idyllic, say arguably more idyllic, picture of relationships between selves and others from the transcendence of the ego, and argues, furthermore, against the more immediately available Heideggerian conception of the relationship between self and other on the basis of the concept of Mitsein, being with, which might place individuals into a kind of necessary and ontologically harmonious presence to one another. In making his critique of Heidegger's concept of Mitsein as a grounding for a non-solipsistic conception of selfhood, Sartre argues, in a post-Kantian fashion, that such a conception of others as presupposed a priori in our everyday experience would make indeterminable the instantiation of the concept of otherness in the case of concrete others. Quote, to say that human reality is with by means of its ontological structure is to say that it is with by nature, that is, in an essential and universal capacity. But even if this affirmation were proved, it would not enable us to explain any concrete being with. In other words, the ontological coexistence, which appears as the structure of being in the world, can in no way serve as a foundation to an ontic being with, such as, for example, the coexistence which appears in my friendship with Pierre, or in the couple which Annie and I make. And it is on the basis of this impossibility of bringing a priori concepts of experience, in this case, the concept of otherness, into contact with specific and empirical others, a problem which Deleuze, owing to his guidance from Maimon, does not have, that Sartre will instead avow a concept of otherness, which, as we all know, is famously revealed to us through our experience of concrete others, manifested in our very way of being as being for others under the imperious look, which commits us to an endless and irresolvable mode of conflict with those who are not ourselves in human society. As Sartre will write, quote, the essence of the relations between consciousness is not the Mitsein, it is conflict, end quote. Next section, Deleuze, Sartre, and the politics of difference. So now we have a kind of point of contact between Sartre's and Deleuze's conceptions of the relationship between self and other. On Deleuze's account, perhaps compatible with the account of consciousness to be found in Sartre's earliest work, a liberatory relationship between self and other can be discovered only after having worked through the imperious character of the a priori other. It is by releasing oneself from the psychological insistence upon the reality of this a priori other that we are better capable of arriving at the singularities characteristic of concrete others. More to say on this in what follows. On the other hand, for Sartre, it is precisely on account of the impossibility of accommodating such contact between self and concrete other that we are compelled to discover otherness only ever in the form of conflict. The other is indubitable, real, and present to our very way of being, but only at the expense of what is at once an oppositional and conflictual conception of our relations. Self and other are in a constant state of conflict and negotiation, moving in dialectical and irreducible ways against one another in an impossible drive towards resolution. Here I want to point towards two what we might call minor texts by Sartre, which I would claim evidence some of the limitations of Sartre's oppositional conception of otherness. That is, the two long essays Black Orpheus and Anti-Semite and Jew, both of which present a conception of self-assertion and political strategy that I would argue are ultimately limited by the ways in which identity is understood in a specifically dialectical manner. Here, much of what Sartre has to say regarding political identity, the identity of peoples in struggle against marginalization and oppression, locates the question of identity within the context of this marginalization and oppression. Michael Walzer notes in his introduction to Anti-Semite and Jew that Sartre's identification of a dialectical dimension of subjectivity, in which we struggle to establish our sense of self over and against the objectifying gaze of the other, valuably shows to us the ways in which, quote, the self-perception of individuals and groups is radically influenced by the often hostile perceptions of others. That is, on this conception, what it means, politically speaking, to be a person of color within the context of racial oppression, or a member of a discriminated against religious minority, will be to have one's identity forced upon oneself by the objectifying or immanentizing look of this other. But as both Walzer and others have observed, if authenticity implies a kind of radical skepticism and freedom with respect to the values and sense of identity that one inherits, and one's situation is defined primarily in terms of an overcoming of the objectification offered to oneself, it will follow almost by necessity that a concept of pluralistic identity dissolves into nothingness beyond the context of the aforementioned marginalization and oppression. As Walzer writes, the Jew in Europe is the exposed face of modern life, but the same role can be played with the same degree of authenticity or inauthenticity by other groups in other times and places. None of these groups have, in Sartre's eyes, any claim on our moral attention beyond the claim they make as persecuted men and women. We should defend the group's existence only so long as its members are persecuted as a group. After that, we defend only their individual rights. End quote. And Sartre writes, of the process of overcoming the problems of the Jewish question, quote, the authentic Jew who thinks of himself as a Jew because the anti-Semite has put him in the situation of a Jew is not opposed to assimilation any more than the class-conscious worker is opposed to the liquidation of classes, end quote. In other words, the authentic Jew anticipates his own assimilation. This criticism of Sartre's limited ability to discuss the nature of identity as a substantive background has been noted by others as well. In his recounting of the reaction to Sartre's famous preface to the poetry anthology edited by Leopold Senghor, entitled Black Orpheus, Souleymane Bachir Dione observes the ways in which, by situating the poetic movement called negritude in terms of its oppositional relationship to colonialism and racism, Sartre equally condemns the poetic and political assertion of the poets in question to a mere dialectical and relativistic position in the history of anti-racist struggle. Indeed, Sartre even goes so far in his essay as to identify the basic attitude of the poet as constitutively refusing this ultimate relativism of his position. He writes that the poets of the anthology, quote, search deep within themselves to find their most secret pride, and when they have found it at last, it challenges its own right to exist, end quote. It is here that Sartre effectively links the concept of autonomous self-assertion within the context of racial and anti-colonial identity to a kind of bad faith. We are unable to move beyond the realm of poetic self-assertion because to move into the sphere of objective political conflict is to commit oneself to the dialectical overcoming of one's identity. Sartre writes, quote, negritude appears like the upbeat of a dialectical progression. The theoretical and practical affirmation of white supremacy is the thesis. The position of negritude as an antithetical value is the moment of negativity. But this negative moment is not sufficient in itself, and these Black men who use it know this perfectly well. They know that it aims at preparing the synthesis or realization of the human being in a raceless society, end quote. And then later affirms that it is the person of color, quote, and he alone, who can be asked to renounce the pride of his color, end quote. Hence, Dion's description of Sartre's ultimately laudatory preference to Senghor's work as a kiss of death to the poetic movement that it intends to valorize. Quote, Sartre takes away from the proletariat their poetic capacity to transfigure the world in order to give it to Black people, but he leaves the proletariat the capacity to actually transform the world. The negritude that he makes into a moment in the dialectic, which will see racial differences reabsorbed into the universal, is not even a true moment. It is more, we should say, a moment in a moment, end quote. Hence, the disappointment described by thinkers like Senghor and Fanon, who refers to Sartre's preface as an unforgiving blow in Black Skin, White Masks, and their efforts to locate a genuinely anti-colonialist struggle in something beyond mere oppositional self-constitution. If Sartre's commitment to political struggle remains wedded to the dialectical conception of difference sketched out in these places, what of Deleuze's approach to the politics of difference and of identity? Here, Deleuze would appear to present a not unproblematic, but perhaps schematically appropriate picture of difference as irreducible to the modes of opposition more naturally captured on a Sartrean account. Deleuze, in his famous conception of minoritarian politics, emphasizes not the question of statistical minority, but rather a position of refusal with respect to the politics of representation, that the aspiration towards mere democratic dominance is inadequate to a revolutionary, anti-racist, or anti-colonialist politics. In Cinema 2, he describes this conception in terms of the ambiguous status of third world cinema as a cinema aspiring to represent a people. Quote, if the people are missing, if there is no longer a project of coming to consciousness, evolution, or revolution, it is the scheme of reversal which itself becomes impossible. There will no longer be conquest of power by a proletariat or by a united and unified people. The death knell for becoming conscious was precisely the consciousness that there were no people, but always several peoples, an infinity of peoples, who remain to be united or should not be united in order for the problem to change, end quote. Here, rather than a merely oppositional sense of political identity, one which relies primarily on a dialectical overthrowing of dominant institutions of power, Deleuze presents us with a conception of radical politics that simultaneously avows the specificity of difference, identifying those ways in which difference is always a rejection of the kinds of systematic oppositions overcoding questions of identity, while refusing to situate this difference within a project of its own eventual liquidation. Does Deleuze go far enough in his understanding of political struggles for equality and in his understanding of the nature of difference? Probably not. It remains a feature of Deleuze's thought to perhaps overly instrumentalize concepts of otherness, racial otherness, ethnic otherness, othernesses of gender and sexual identity, in the service of a project of nomadism, which leaves even oppressed groups obligated to undertake their own projects of becoming other. Yet at the same time, the attempt that Deleuze presents to understand identity beyond the domain of constitutive oppositions, a domain in which political struggle must be understood as either interminable or as committed to the destruction of political identity as such, perhaps lends to Deleuze's account a possibility for genuinely harmonious conceptions of otherness, conceptions in which, to refer us to Deleuze's own uptake of Sartre's Transcendence of the ego, self and other find themselves in a relationship of natural commerce and aid and without priority. No more, Sartre writes in that place, is needed in the way of a philosophical foundation for an ethics and a politics which are absolutely positive. Thank you.